All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today's webinar hosted by SWEEP, Southwest Energy Efficiency Project, and Plug in America. Today's webinar is entitled Beyond NEVI, Exploring Federal Funding Opportunities for Electric Vehicle Planning and Infrastructure in Arizona. We have a really dynamic set of speakers for you today to really dive deep into the details that you need in order to begin your planning process for applying for federal funding opportunities and really increasing and improving infrastructure opportunities and planning for transportation electrification. Very excited to begin the conversation with you today. So for now, I'm going to turn it over to my co-host, Alexia with Plug in America, to discuss the Zoom setup and webinar.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. It's great to see so many different people on the line. Just to run through a couple Zoom notes here, just for your reference. If you're having any trouble hearing us, please use the audio settings function to adjust, where your audio input and output are coming from. Feel free to use the chat box at the bottom of your screen to share any thoughts that you might have in reaction to the presentations that you're hearing and introduce yourself to, fellow attendees. We hope to encourage you all to meet each other and work with each other as well. And please use the Q&A box to ask any questions. We'll be collecting these questions throughout the presentations, and we'll have a segment for a Q&A at the end. So we'll be able to share those all with the panelists that we have lined up for you. And then lastly, we are recording this webinar, and we'll definitely be sharing that recording after the webinar for your use moving forward. So Karen, I think we can go ahead and get started.
Great, thank you so much, Alexia. And we'll just really quickly cover the diversity of speakers that we have today and topics that they're going to be covering. We have Arizona Department of Transportation to talk a bit about stakeholder engagement and their NEVI planning. We have the U.S. Department of Transportation to talk about rural, city, and town engagement and preparation for federal programs. We have Tucson Electric Power to talk about beneficial electrification, transportation electrification, and partnerships with local governments. We have the Electrification Coalition to cover their aspects of their local government playbook, and also forth as well to talk about technical assistance and writing assistance when it comes to CFI program applications. And with that, let's move on to our first presenter for today. We have the Arizona Department of Transportation with Diane Kreshik. Diane, feel free to turn on your video and audio, and feel free to get started when you're ready.
Hello, everyone, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me to represent ADOT and share a foundation of information on NEVI. I know the theme here is Beyond NEVI, but I will give you some background on what ADOT has worked on and where we are working now and what we plan to do in the near future. Go ahead, Karen. So as you probably very well know, NEVI is the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Formula Program that is providing $5 billion to state DOTs to build a network of fast charging stations along the highways. In Arizona thus far, it has been our interstate highways that we have planned for, but we are planning beyond that this year. The goal here, a number one thing ADOT likes to say, is that we are aiming to reduce anxiety, range anxiety for the EV traveler, but so many other things as well, provide that equitable, accessible, reliable access to EV charging across our state. So NEVI requires that we annually develop a plan for EV charging, and we conduct extensive outreach to the public and to our other many stakeholders, which we did for the development of the plan in 2022. It requires that the stations be placed at least every 50 miles and within 1 mile of a highway that has been designated as an alternative fuels corridor, which is a federal designation. As I said, thus far, the interstate highways are our AFCs. The stations have to be able to charge 4 vehicles simultaneously at a fast charging level. We're required to provide 97% reliability at these stations once we get them in place. And of course, we have to comply with the federal Justice 40 initiative. Right. Next slide. So Justice 40, I'm sure you are familiar with it, but it requires that at least 40% of the benefits of how we use our NEVI funding are targeted toward disadvantaged communities. And these exist throughout Arizona, urban, rural, and tribal areas. And we anticipate that these benefits could include increased tourism, over a long run, improved air quality, certainly job opportunities in the installation of EV chargers and the maintenance of those stations as well. Go ahead, next slide. As I said, the chargers that ADOT installs, or that ADOT contractors install across the state, will be level 3 charging with the CCS connectors for compatibility across many types of vehicles. I won't get into all those technical looking details right there at this time. Arizona is eligible to receive over $76 million across the 5 years of the program, but it can only be used according to the NEVI requirements, the construction of those EV fast charging stations along the alternative fuel corridors. And this is for that NEVI formula funding part of the program. There are, as I'm sure you know too, many other pieces of NEVI, and we are learning more and more about them. Next slide. So in Arizona, we approved our first year plan. We developed and it was approved last year in 2022. We are required to update that plan throughout the life of the NEVI program. And we will be establishing and overseeing contracts. We've gotten that started. The contracts that will hire the contractors to build, operate, and maintain these stations that we identified in last year's plan. So last year's plan was established the rough locations of stations along the interstate. This year, we're going to develop the contracts into early next year to hire those people who will actually be building those stations. At the same time this year, we're also updating the plan. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that soon. The EV plan goals, I think the key one is that upper left: build a resilient, equitable, accessible, reliable network, and reduce the anxiety of the driver wondering where his EV or her EV is going to be able to charge up next. So we'll be filling those gaps. Next slide. In Arizona, the stations, although ADOT is administering the process and the program, the stations will be privately owned as well as privately operated and maintained. The cost of all this will be covered 80% by the federal funds and 20% by those private entities. State funding won't be used in Arizona. And a question we often get is whether we would be locating these at rest stops or other ADOT rights of way. And no, we won't be. There are restrictions on business use of these sites on state property. Next slide. So here is our complete map that we developed in 2022, showing the existing stations that right now comply with NEVI requirements. We see where stations may be potentially upgraded to meet NEVI requirements and where the new stations would be located. So they're at least every 50 miles across our interstates. And in only 2 places were we granted exceptions in that 50-mile requirement. It's a little longer gap, I think 57 miles up on I-40 and another one on I-8 that is a 67-mile gap. And that has to do with the availability of where the off ramps are and such, the interchanges, utilities, etc. We did this with a lot of engagement with stakeholders from public sector, other government agencies, private industry, advocacy groups, the public. We met virtually, we met in person, we had surveys, we had dedicated email, we still do. If there are questions, please use that, azevplan@azdot.gov. And throughout this process, we've had translation in Spanish and Navajo if needed. So ADOT did take this task of public engagement very seriously. And I think it was well worth it. Next slide. I've talked about these alternative fuel corridors, and I just want to quickly let you know that we have gone through a process and prioritized the remaining routes that were on the national highway system, because that's a requirement that they be designated on. A lot of levels of requirements here. But on the next slide, I think this is the more, go ahead, next slide. These are the highest priority roads we've identified next. These will be addressed by our new 2023 update to the EV plan. So we'll be looking at these route segments and determining where the charging stations would be located. Next. So I think I pretty much covered where we are and where we're going. That new plan, the update, we believe it will be due August 1st this year to the joint office, US DOT and Department of Energy joint office. And around that time, August or so, we plan to release the RFP for determining contractors to implement the plan for stations we identified in 2022. Next slide. There's our website. You'll find lots of information there. A QR code can get you there too. We have videos from past events. We have the plan itself, and that is where we'll be making announcements as new information becomes available. So thank you, everyone.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that overview, Diane. Really appreciate it. Next up, we have Lily Ballingy with USDOT Routes Office. And maybe, Lily, if you can settle a debate that we've had on if you prefer to pronounce it routes or routes. So would love that clarification. But at any rate, please proceed when you're ready. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. And that is a great question. And one I will note that we also have internally. I am team routes. I will use both probably interchangeably, and I often start my presentations, probably not today given Zoom, but you're welcome to participate, by seeing whether people pronounce it routes or routes in the chat. But so my name is Lily Ballingy. I am a member of the U.S. Department of Transportation's Routes Initiative. As I said, routes, not routes. And I'm here today to present on our Rural EV Infrastructure Toolkit, formerly known as Charging Forward, a toolkit for planning and funding rural electric mobility infrastructure. Next slide, please. So first of all, just a quick note about what we are, what Routes is, or the Routes Initiative. So it does stand for Rural Opportunities to Use Transportation for Economic Success, and therefore is really the Rural Transportation Policy Office, essentially within the Department of Transportation. So we do have a portfolio of all things rural, working with stakeholders at the local level, across modal administrations within the DOT, and across federal partners at the rural focused agencies to really kind of create a holistic approach to addressing some of those disparities in rural transportation infrastructure that we're all very familiar with, being in rural communities, improving safety, improving economic competitiveness, mobility, this desire to bring EVs to the nation as a whole. I will, have my contact information, but I do want to note that, our portfolio is all things rural, so feel free to reach out for technical assistance, resources, however we can help. Next slide. So the topic of today is the Rural EV Infrastructure Toolkit. It's one of those resources that we do develop to really try to get the information that is most pertinent to rural communities and tribal communities to them without all the extra fluff that you occasionally see. So the Rural EV Infrastructure Toolkit was first released in February of 2022. It includes all those information on the table of contents, most of the things I will touch on today, basic information that you need regarding EVs, types of chargers, benefits and challenges, many of which, I'll touch on today, partnership opportunities, EV infrastructure planning, and then funding and financing opportunities. It includes information that's not just DOT specific, some best practices, and that infrastructure funding and financing does incorporate, whole of government approach, touching on available funding opportunities from across the department or the departments, excuse me. And then in terms of some planned updates coming very soon, hopefully next week, we will have our revision. So we knew once we implemented this first version that there would already going to be a need for an update, just given the timing of some of those new funding programs that were included in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, notably NEVI, which is what we're here today, to touch on, as well as that Charging and Fueling Infrastructure Discretionary Grant Program. They had yet kind of been implemented, of course, and we're still figuring out how to incorporate them. So those information will all be included in the new update, as well as some greater content and expansion relating to transit, tribal communities, school buses, micromobility, and accessible design, just based on some of that stakeholder feedback we saw. Next slide, please. So I'm going to move kind of quickly. I will note that all of this is available in the toolkit currently updated, and the new toolkit will simply replace that one once available. So the links will remain the same. But in terms of some benefits for individuals that we do see in relation to rural communities, especially, is that lower ownership costs for individuals. Long-term maintenance fees and fueling fees, as we noticed, are likely to be lower for electric vehicles. There's this opportunity for a more accessible fueling infrastructure since, many people can charge their vehicles in their driveways, in their garages, at their work, at their school, at the gym, allowing them to kind of always have a full tank opportunity, at least coming from from one location to another. There are more vehicle options than ever before, and we're finally seeing, a direct influx of vehicles that might be more useful to rural communities, thinking about trucks, thinking about SUVs, the ability to haul information and materials, and then also, of course, increased resilience. So some EVs do have that bidirectional charger that allows them to act as a generator in the situation of a natural disaster or some emergency event. Of course, and Diane already touched on some of the rural community, impacts related to economic development just through increased tourism, travel, money being spent at restaurants, hotels, public access to parks, for example, improve public health through reduced brake dust, through air pollution, through lower greenhouse gas emissions, as listed here as the last one. So there are some great benefits that we really want people to be aware of and to have the opportunity to really access and benefit from. Next slide. However, along with benefits does come challenges. So there are those high upfront costs still, despite that longer term, lower maintenance fees. A vehicle, electric vehicle currently does cost more than a conventional vehicle, although there are, there are efforts to lower that we're working on throughout the federal government and state governments for that matter. So there's also, as mentioned, this need for a 50-mile, distance between chargers, which sometimes isn't reasonable for rural communities. Thinking about states in the Midwest and the West for that matter, where we might not have the grid to support that, which does lead us to a potential need for grid upgrades, where the existing electrical grid doesn't have the capacity necessary, or in some cases might not even exist yet. Permitting and installation does come with some frustrations because each community has its own ordinances, has its own requirements, and what you do in one community might not allow you to do the same next door. Similarly, we have seen a limited exposure related to EVs in rural communities, just based on the fact that when this technology was first implemented, as usual, unfortunately, it was directed largely for urban communities where it was expected that we'd have, immediate benefits, and where that range anxiety wouldn't have been such a problem. Whereas now we are expanding, thank goodness, to rural communities, but we want to make sure everyone is aware of those benefits and of, the resources available to help them. Next slide, please. So in terms of partnership opportunities, I think it's clear by the representatives on this presentation today that it takes a village. And that is one of kind of the best practices that we do recommend from the U.S. Department of Transportation, is really to work with a diverse partnership group, of those people represented on the screen today and in this call today, to really help support, your planning, your funding, and that implementation of these types of projects. Next slide, please. In terms of some guiding principles, I just want to touch on this idea that, I kind of alluded to it already, but there really isn't a one-size-fits-all approach. So the EV Toolkit does set forth, some guidance information, some best practices, some steps. However, each one might look a little bit different based on the partners involved, based on the funding available, based on the existing grid infrastructure, et cetera. So those are just some things to keep in mind, and try not to get so frustrated. Obviously, that makes sense, but little changes might help. And so because of that, some of those aspects of planning can occur in parallel rather than in the step-by-step iteration. So I will touch on in one moment one of the best tools, in my opinion, in the toolkit, and that's a project planning checklist that does kind of list through a lot of the different steps that you will likely need to take implementing an EV infrastructure installation. But it's worth noting that not all of those will take place in the order that's represented. Some of them might require you to revisit or revise earlier steps to move forward. And so because of that need to coordinate early and often with the partners involved in that planning process, but also with stakeholders to make sure that everyone is benefiting appropriately is another best practice. And then, of course, building for flexibility just as this technology continues to change. And for example, trying to put in the infrastructure in place now that might benefit you for the future. Next slide, please. So here is the project planning checklist I did reference. So it is included in the toolkit. And in fact, the toolkit is kind of broken up by these topics. So, project development and scoping, utility planning, installation planning, and operational planning. It's a very hands-on approach, and each section does incorporate some additional tools and resources, to help you along that decision process. Next slide, please. So here are just a few of those tools and resources I did allude to. And no, they're not all DOT specific. Some of them are borrowed, as you see, from our Department of Energy friends, from public action or activities, for private engagements, some things that are here to help you navigate your own process. And this just kind of communicates a few of them: calculators, maps, templates, guidance documents. We recommend, digging a little deeper, checking out what else there is available to you. Next slide, please. So one of the key elements of the Rural EV Toolkit is this list of program types and eligibilities and the diverse federal programs that do exist across the federal government to support EV activity. So you see here on the left, it's not just USDOT programs, as I mentioned. Yes, it's a USDOT product, but we worked very closely with our federal partners across the government to incorporate their types of funding. So it includes discretionary funding, it includes formula, includes loans and tax incentives. The new version, as I mentioned, will include NEVI. It includes the CFI programs. It includes, if you're familiar with our RAISE program at USDOT, it now allows for EV charging. So it's a little very comprehensive documentation. It incorporates different applicant types as well as EV activities. So it does help you sort of choose your own adventure, if you will, to make sure that you get what works best for you. Next slide, please. And so along those lines, there is this 11-page resource. The new version might be a little longer, we'll see, but it does incorporate a comprehensive list of those federal programs. It's searchable through an Excel, as well as has some kind of flagged information regarding the type of applicant types and activities. So I highly encourage you to check it out if you haven't. If you have already, I'm sorry I wasted your time. And but look for a new version, hopefully coming out next week. And then next slide. With that, I do want to say thank you for being here, for joining us. Our contact information is available here. The toolkit is available at transportation.gov/rural/EV toolkit. But I also encourage you to check out the rest of our slides for other resources that are not necessarily too directly relevant to EVs, but still relevant to rural communities. So thank you so much and have a great day.
Thank you, Lily. Appreciate it very much for all the details. So next up, we're going to shift gears to the utility sector and focus on Tucson Electric Power's efforts in this area. So Camilla, please take it away when you're ready.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Camila Martins-Beckott. I'm a principal for beneficial electrification for TEP and UNSC. I thought I would take the time today to talk to you about some of the things that TEP has done that have been a little bit more out of the box in terms of partnering with our local customers. And I'll get into transit electrification a little bit later, but I wanted to start off saying that our service approach to our customers is really all about partnership and how we can each bring value to each other's objectives. And so we have been working very closely with Pima County and the city of Tucson on their fleet electrification efforts, providing them with a lot of technical assistance, financial assistance, as well as some fleet planning services, particularly around total cost of ownership, so that they can really identify the best routes that need to that can be served by electric vehicles, and how they're going to plan from a budgetary perspective to accomplish those goals. We had a unique opportunity to partner with the National Forest Service. For any of those that have been to Sabino Canyon, it is quite a pristine area here in the Pima County area. And there used to be a tram that went up and down the canyon, and it was a diesel tram, and it was a little bit loud and emitted a lot of emissions. And when that contract was up for renewal, we partnered with PAG, which is Pima Association of Governments, and we created a new entity, a nonprofit, that actually runs the electric trams now. We donated some of our shareholder dollars for the effort, but we also were able to leverage that as a local match in order to secure the contract for those services. We do some strategic infrastructure deployment to bring public charging to the areas that do not have public charging. What you see there is located outside of our headquarters office, and it's free charging to, or complimentary charging to anybody that, can we go back to the slide, please? Thank you. That anybody that comes to the downtown area that does not have any DC fast charging available. Unfortunately, they're currently down for service, which kind of highlights one of the things that we have to think about as we start deploying infrastructure throughout the state, is how do we ensure that these stations remain operational, both from a software, network, and hardware perspective. Next slide, please. So this is where I get into our work with Suntran a little bit. So about 3.5 years ago, the city of Tucson had a climate emergency declaration, along with some additional efforts around becoming more climate resilient. There was a grant through the FTA that the city was interested in pursuing in order to do a pilot electric bus. And they needed some financial support as well as some technical assistance to not only make their application competitive, but to ensure that they were getting the right equipment associated with the bus that they were going to have on site. And so from that kind of initial conversation of one bus, we've kind of now grown to 29 buses, making Suntran the transit agency in the Southwest with the most number of electric buses. We've done 3 rounds with them, offering them financial assistance for the charging infrastructure. And when I say technical assistance, we do play a number of roles with our customers, right? Sometimes we're there to provide technical assistance. We're there to kind of be in the teacher role, or sometimes we're there to be in the learner role. And so it's quite a dynamic relationship, but we have been able to secure over $18 million in FTA grants. And the city does have a sustained long-term commitment to electric transportation. Next slide. So this is kind of the next phase of the things that we're working on. We do have an approved ACC Transportation Electrification Implementation Plan, which has focuses on offerings to a variety of different customer segments that we have. One of those is school buses. When the EPA came out with their first round of funding, we met with all of our school districts, and what we heard from them was, while the EPA funding is quite robust, it's still not quite sufficient to get us over the hurdle to electrify, because there would still be some funds that the school districts would have to come up with. And so in our implementation plan, we put in a request for funding to cover the incremental costs of the electric buses that wasn't covered by the EPA funding. And we did that for schools that primarily serve low to moderate income students. We also have a charging infrastructure incentive, kind of providing this wraparound program where we also do fleet transition plans for the schools. So we're just kicking that off right now. The EPA came out with their second round last week, and so we're working toward doing a workshop with the school districts. It's a little hard to get them scheduled toward the end of the year, so we're aiming for the June timeframe for that. With all of the federal funding opportunities that are out there, we really wanted to see how we could kind of leverage some of our existing efforts through our implementation plan, but also deliver unique offerings to the communities that we serve through the identification of gaps. And one of the gaps that we've identified is we have a number of people that utilize public transit in Tucson. And while our transit system is quite robust, a lot of times in order to kind of get to their final destination, right, like there's still that last mile that needs to occur and usually occurs on foot. And so our thought is that we are going to partner with the city of Tucson and Pima County to put in a request for a car sharing program. And we are indeed going to pursue this. No guarantees, right? It's federal funding, it's competitive. But the thought there is that we would place electric vehicles at the transit centers or in close approximation to the transit centers where adjacent parking isn't available, so that individuals could utilize those vehicles for their last mile trips. It would be open to everybody in the community, but due to their location, the kind of population that we're looking to serve, our transit users, we would also have a tiered pricing system that for income qualified customers, there would be a slightly smaller fee to use the vehicles, kind of in alignment with that Justice 40 initiatives that we see through the federal program requirements. We're also in conversations with a broader consortium of partners for charging infrastructure deployment in suburban and rural areas. Vast majority of our customers are urban, but we do have a community cooperative next door to us in terms of service territory, TRICO, and we're in the kind of exploratory phases of how we could partner together along with Pima County and the city of Tucson to really bring about a comprehensive approach to charging infrastructure in our areas. I point out the fact that we have a super diverse coalition of community partners because that's what it takes in order to get a lot of these programs done. You know, the federal funding is great, but you still have to come up with a 20% match. And that can be quite a hefty lift when you're talking about these larger scale programs. So those are some of the best practices and opportunities that I think can be replicated in other communities as well. And I think that's the end of my slides.
Fantastic. Thank you, Camilla. Really great tips for utilizing the different types of resources that different jurisdictions have to work together to find common solutions and projects to fulfill this need. So really appreciate the tips. So, and speaking about creative ways to help local governments prepare for federal funding opportunities for transportation, I'd like to turn it over to Rebecca with the Electrification Coalition.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. My name is Rebecca Saraboth. I'm a senior EV infrastructure at the Infrastructure Associate. Ooh, that's a mouthful. At the Electrification Coalition. We are a nonpartisan nonprofit organization that's dedicated to driving the policies and actions that will electrify all modes of transportation to protect economic and national security, public health, and American jobs. And we do that in partnership with SAFE, our sister organization. You can go ahead to the next slide. So like Karen said, I'm here to talk about a couple of our tools and resources that will help in this transition to electric vehicles. First is our most recent tool is the EV Funding Finder, which is a user-friendly tool to identifying federal funding opportunities for transportation electrification. We created the EV Funding Finder because time and time again, we were asked the question, where is the money and how do I get it? And we said, we probably know how to answer that question. And we also did it to capitalize on this unprecedented investment in transportation electrification from the federal government. And finally, we did it to support efficient, effective, and equitable deployment of funds to reach these ambitious goals that we know Arizona has set. Go ahead to the next slide. So the QR code will take you to the EV funding finder, and maybe I'll be able to send it in the chat in a few moments. It first and foremost lowers the barrier to entry to identifying and accessing federal funding opportunities for transportation and electrification. So you'll see it's sort of like a quiz almost. When you start with the funding finder, it will, I think I actually have a demo in a slide or two, so I'll save that for later, but it also shows how funding opportunities can be stacked and which alternative routes can be utilized to fund projects. So if the Clean School Bus program is not, an option, it'll show you other funds that you can take advantage of for things like clean school buses. And finally, it provides case studies that show potential use of funds. So if you go ahead to the next slide, you'll see what the funding finder looks like. It starts on this page that will ask you who you represent. There's a QR code again in case you're looking to go to the site. Then there are a bunch of scenarios. So those are things like purchasing a light duty vehicle, infrastructure, grid support, planning, technical assistance, ports, pretty much anything you could think of. And then if you go to the next slide, after you make your way through the funding finder, it'll take you to a nice page that looks a little something like this, that on the right will pull up funds that you should be eligible to apply for. I will say we are updating the funding finder as new information becomes available, and this is to the best of our knowledge. We are not the ones that are reading applications over at the Electrification Coalition, and we're still missing some information. So the information on the finder is up to date as we know. So you'll see that list on the right. If you click on each of those links, a little description will pop up that will tell you more about when the application is due, how you can maybe combine the funds, what sort of local match is needed. And then on the left of the page, you'll see sort of a fictional case study about a community that's utilizing multiple funds to sort of electrify all of their transportation. And our hope is that as these funds are awarded and EVs are deployed on the streets, to turn these case studies into real case studies featuring cities and towns across the United States. So that is tool number 1. And then the next tool that I have to share, which should be on the next slide, is one of our more recent reports called the Local Government Playbook. It contains actions and strategies that local governments can enact now and in the future, including best practices, policy approaches, and lessons from previous public charging deployments. It talks about policy action, state and regional planning, stakeholder and community engagement, and site planning. And our goal with the Local Government Playbook was to point out local governments throughout the report that are, have enacted a bunch of the recommendations that are within the report. So if you go to the next slide, it just sort of briefly touches on the recommendations that we make within the report. I won't read all of them. This is sort of a really high level overview. I want to emphasize, like many of the speakers before me touched on, the stakeholder engagement piece is definitely super topical and relevant in identifying key stakeholders and building equity-centric plans, and then developing these high-level, robust implementation plans. But that report is also available on our website, and it has a bunch of examples of local governments that have done, many of these things that I would be, happy to follow up with any questions on later. And then I think I've got one more slide here that just sort of talks about expanded eligible uses of regular transportation dollars. So these are programs that you might be familiar with that through the infrastructure law are now eligible to use on transportation electrification. So this slide will be sent out and this information will be available, but I think it's awesome because it shows, all of the momentum and the fact that, the wind is at our backs as we're trying to do all of these awesome things. So 2 resources for you, plenty of more resources on our website as well. I'd be remiss not to mention our Drive tool, which is a TCO calculator that helps with fleet conversion, and a ton of other tools that live on our website. So I'm going to stop there and hand it back over to you, Karen.
Fantastic. Thank you, Rebecca. Really appreciate the comprehensive overview of tools that local governments, tribal entities, and really anyone from across the state can use to really, up their planning for transportation electrification. So it's fantastic. And speaking of that, I'd like to turn it over to Kevin Whitforth to talk about specifics when it comes to CFI and ways we local governments can overcome the barriers for the grant writing and technical assessment process. So take it away, Kevin. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Kevin Hashi, and I'm a program manager with Fourth. Fourth is a nonprofit, and our mission is to electrify transportation by bringing people together to create solutions that reduce pollution and barriers to access. Next slide, please. So the Charging and Fueling Infrastructure Program, or CFI, was issued by the Department of Transportation. It's a 3-year program, $2.5 billion over those 3 years. For this year's round of funding, there is $700 million available, and that is split up between the Corridors Program and the Community Charging Program. So $350 million for each of those. And individual grants can be up to $15 million. Eligible applicants of the grants are states and local governments, metropolitan planning organizations, tribes, special districts, authorities, and agencies. There's also a required 20% match. So this may come from private investment, such as a charging service provider or utility. And applications for this round of funding are due May 30th. So very quick turnaround time, as the notice of funding opportunity was released on March 15th. But you can also get prepared for next year's round of funding too late. Next slide, please. So some of the priorities that the Department of Transportation is considering, the CFI is really looking to align with the administration's Justice 40 initiative, where 40% of the benefits go towards underserved communities. So DOT is really placing an emphasis on charging in rural areas, charging in low and moderate income neighborhoods, and communities that have a high ratio of multifamily housing. As we see, those are some of the gaps in the charging network. And DOT would also like to see applications that meet the current charging demand and also potentially the future anticipated demand of charging. And they would like to see projects that include faster charging speeds or the appropriate mix of charging speeds. So maybe adding level 2 on to the DC fast charging as well. And they're also looking to see applications that have an innovative approach, as this opportunity sort of is a little bit flexible in nature. Next slide, please. So some of the eligible expenses, planning activities are definitely eligible. So, your feasibility analysis, environmental reviews, engineering and design work, that's all good. Acquisition of real property, traffic control devices, and signage to direct people to the chargers. You can also contract with a private entity for up to 5 years to own and to operate and maintain the chargers. So as we see, a lot of municipalities don't want to have that on their plate. And educational and community engagement activities can be up to 5% of the project budget, but meaningful public engagement, as listed in the NOFO, it has no cap on the percentage of the project budget. So we recommend, really engaging with community. Next slide, please. So just some general advice about the CFI is, I would say, to center people and not technology. Far too often we see projects that focus too much on the tech and not enough about the end user experience. Additionally, ensure that the project benefits the community. So engage with the community, find out what they want, where they want it, and also, sort of on that note, is build broad partnerships. Talk with your utility and talk with community-based organizations. Establish those relationships now before you need to, get their input. Establish that relationships. Then going forward, you're ready for that input. And talk with the surrounding communities if they're thinking about CFI, and possibly submit a regional approach. That is something that the Department of Transportation mentioned that they'd like to see as sort of a collaborative regional approach, as the money can be spent a little more efficiently that way. Next slide, please. So some ways that Forth can assist. If you go to the top link here, you can input your information, and we can, we'll have that contact information to provide technical assistance to you for either, this year's round of funding, if you need some last minute help, or, get you prepared for next year's round of funding, so that you can be proactive about that. Additionally, Fort's annual roadmap conference is May 15th to 17th in Portland, Oregon, and we'll be hosting a federal funding workshop, which will help guide communities and help them take advantage of these EV infrastructure federal opportunities. Thank you.
Karen, I think
Thank you, Kevin. Oh. Thank you so much. You caught me. Appreciate it. Thank you all to our speakers for all these great tips and tricks and recommendations for really maximizing, opportunities with transportation funding from the federal level. So now for the last about 12 minutes that we have for the webinar, we're going to move over to questions that we're getting from the Q&A and other places as well. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Tyler Merriweather with SWEEP, to start going through some of those questions.
Thanks a lot, Karen. So the first couple questions that we have will be directed at all the speakers. Anyone can chime in. So the first one will be, will the slide decks be sent out to any attendees?
Yeah, I'm happy to answer that one. Yes, everything that we've shared today, that these fantastic speakers have shared with you all today, we will be sending that out around afterwards. And we have an exciting note for you at the end, which we'll get to as well, which is a new resource in development that works to compile all of these other resources so that you kind of have a one-stop shop in terms of finding all of the places that you can get help and assistance.
Thanks a lot, Alexia. And then for the next one, it's actually directed at Diane. And so Diane, do you have any suggestions for ways local governments can incorporate Justice 40 initiatives within our transportation projects? And how can we make equity a regular component of transportation moving forward?
I'm afraid I'm probably not the right person to give you the best answer to that. You're referring to your projects in general, transportation projects. You're probably aware of the mapping tool that was created at the federal level. ADOT certainly has used that to identify the communities. I would think that extended outreach to those areas would be appropriate. I imagine that you are probably already engaged in that kind of activity, but something that we considered at ADOT in that regard was just going a little beyond. We did hear after we submitted our plan and were receiving feedback from the joint office, how pleased and impressed they were, to be honest, with ADOT's engagement effort. How that plays out in the long run is yet to be seen. We are required to measure the effect of our decisions on those disadvantaged communities, measure the benefits and such. And that is a challenge. If you're feeling challenged by that, I think that is very reasonable. I have read that at the federal level, they are developing some method for measurement. We certainly are giving thought to that and have some preliminary information in our 2022 plan. But I suspect that measurement is a key, because that's how we get feedback on our efforts and can improve upon them.
Diane, actually, if you don't mind, I'd happily support your response here from that federal perspective. So I will note that the Rural EV Toolkit does include some guidance related to equity considerations in planning. It's actually a slide I normally keep in, but I dropped it out for time, unfortunately, which was not very equitable of me. I see that now. But it does, considering safety, considering, underserved communities, as well as links to some tools that can be used to help, with that that metric as appropriate. Similarly, DOT did put out the promising practices for engagement with communities. I forget the formal title. It is also linked in the toolkit's very long title, that can kind of help in terms of outreach and engagement to ensure kind of that equitable engagement for decision making. So another great resource to touch on, but thank you.
Great. So the next question is actually for Kevin. Kevin, what defines a rural community?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I don't believe the notice of funding opportunity is super clear on what a rural community actually is. But, I would say, if you believe your community is a rural community, then, write that in your application, make that story, play to the priorities of the Department of Transportation, because that's going to, create a more competitive application. So, if you believe that those chargers are being placed in a rural community or serving those that live in a rural community, definitely mention that.
Sorry, Kevin, I don't mind popping in one more time. I just wanted to also note that so the rural, or it's not the rural toolkit, the Routes website does list various definitions for rural. Rural is, there's a lot of definitions across the DOT, as let alone across the federal government in terms of rural. For many of those OST programs, they do kind of look at census related, outside of an urban area of 200,000 or less. For some transit specific programs, it might be 50,000 or less, but I will drop a link in the chat. I don't know if it's all encompassing. I'm trying to remember if it does include CFI or NEVI on it right at this moment, but that's something to take away. Thanks.
Sounds good. And then the next question we got here is for Rebecca. Regarding the CFI program, are you aware of any entities planning to submit a proposal that are open to, that are open or looking to partner with local municipalities? There are many communities that are interested but lack capacity to be a lead applicant.
That's a great question. Thanks for asking. I don't know that I could right off the top of my head name any right now, but I know that that is most certainly an encouraged option, and that the CFI program itself has many priorities. One is safety, one is scalability, and then another is collaboration. So that seems really like a great idea. And I can definitely do some more digging if whomever asked this question wants to reach out. I'm happy to try to connect to some more folks on the ground.
And just to add on to that briefly, something that we've also asked the Joint Office of Energy and Transportation is around whether they're planning to put together a kind of a teaming partner list for the specific CFI opportunity. That's something that you might have seen for other federal grant funding opportunities. So we are looking at working with them to provide that resource for next year's round of funding to make that easy for all of you.
Sounds good. And then the next question is for Camilla at Tucson Electric Power. How can local governments work with utilities to improve the efficiency of charging so that costly building and distribution upgrades can be reduced?
Yeah, I think everybody's kind of heard a lot of the utilities say this all the time, but come to talk to us often and early. That is the best way that we can kind of plan for the future together, identify areas where we already have system improvements in place that we can kind of tweak a little bit in order to accommodate additional EV load. So, call us up, email us. That really is the best way.
Thank you for that. And then this is for all speakers. Kevin, would you explain what is meant by community charging that was mentioned in your slides?
Yeah. So the community charging, portion of the CFI is a little more flexible than the corridors. So, the benefits or the desire of the community charging is, for the benefits to go to that local community. As the corridor program, you see the benefits can also go to the community, but then travelers, along that corridor. So, depending on what project you're thinking about, I think for many communities, the community charging project may be more well suited if you're looking for, to fill different specific gaps. So if you have a lot of multifamily housing in the area, then you'll with other amenities, then you'll want to pursue the community charging, for example.
So just to add a little foundation to that, the community and fueling infrastructure grants are another aspect of the federal NEVI program coming out of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. And there are definitely rules and requirements for each of those, as Kevin was explaining. They also go beyond electrification. They include, depending on what aspect you may be interested in, hydrogen fuels and other alternative fuels are included across that program. There are two aspects, as Kevin said. Corridor grants, which, as an example, it's something ADOT in the future might consider applying for, to if our NEVI formula funding is inadequate to cover the state, according to the 50-mile requirement and such. We have no plan at the moment. We actually feel very confident that the NEVI formula funding is going to allow us to complete our network. But should it not, we might go for a corridor grant. The community grants are the ones that I bet most of the listeners here are interested in. If you are representing industry, you probably want to speak to the local jurisdiction. You may be interested in establishing charging and such. So it's another, I like to give things context and explain the layers, but there are a lot of layers, of course. It is part of that federal program.
Great, thank you for that. And the next one is also for all panelists. The number of programs and funding types are very overwhelming. How do you recommend rural towns, cities, counties, and tribal governments prioritize funding sources if we have limited grant writing staff?
That's such a tough one, but I think the answer is in developing broad coalitions so that each individual person can bring forth kind of a particular skill set or a particular aspect of one of the requirements of the grant.
Yeah, I absolutely agree to that. And I'll just add a little bit of a perspective as well on this. So there is actually one, grant opportunity specifically for Arizona entities that Local First Arizona provides. It's called the Economic Recovery Center, and they offer access for some of the smaller, rural cities, towns, and counties kind of across our state that might not have this staffing available directly on staff today. So if you're interested in that, we'll put a link in the chat and happy to connect you to some of those resources if it's a good fit for you.
And just following up on that, I see that we're 1 minute off of time. So just want to start to wrap us up. I think that was a really great question to end on. I know that this is top of mind for a lot of you, is how to sift through all of these dollars. It's great that we have so much on the table, but it's almost spoiled for choice trying to figure out where do we start? So I'd just like to turn it back to all these speakers to say that these are some of the folks that can really help you through this process. Please reach out to them. They've built amazing tools to help you sift through these things like the EV Funding Finder, the routes, the rural EV toolkit, Fourth software to help with grant writing assistance. Those are all sources that you should feel comfortable leveraging as you kind of try to navigate this process. And even if you don't know where to start, that's a good place to start, is to say, I need to figure out, what is the first step. So in that vein, something that we just wanted to close out with is that we'll be sharing all of this information with you after the webinar, both the slides, the recording, and that resource that I mentioned, which will compile all of these great tools. And just wanted to extend our gratitude and our thanks to all of these fantastic speakers here today. You've given us a lot to think about, of course, and a lot of places to go to find kind of who can help and how can we build these really strong coalitions so that we can develop projects that deliver benefits to the communities that need it most. Karen, anything else from you?
I think that's it for now. Thank you, Alexia, and thank you all for joining. We'll be in touch soon with some follow-up materials. Signing off for now. Thank you all. Have a great day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.